Hi everybody, it's Bill from The Walks of Life. Today we're gonna talk about pork ribs. So pork ribs can be really confusing. You've got St. Louis ribs, baby back ribs, spare ribs, you got country ribs, you got rib tips, whole racks of ribs, riblets that we sometimes use for steaming. It's all somewhat confusing. So I'm gonna give you all the ins and outs, and I'm gonna give you tips and tricks on how to select, cut, and prepare your pork ribs for all of our dishes. I have a full rack of spare ribs that includes the breastbone. These are the most economical. You get the best price on these. I've got a baby back rib here. If you want it to cook a little bit faster, because they're smaller, and you want a more tender, meatier cut, then use the baby back ribs. And then I've got a St. Louis rib here. So when you think about a pig and ribs, there's basically three portions. You got the top closer to the spine, which is actually this baby back rib. Then when you go a little bit lower, you get the spare ribs. Now the spare ribs consist of your St. Louis ribs, and then at the bottom is your rib tip. Now the baby back ribs, the one that's closer to the spine, that is actually part of your pork loin, which is actually a pork chop. So every time you're eating a center cut pork chop, or if you get a pork roast with a bone-in pork roast, it's the same thing. If you actually cut the ribs off of that pork roast, you're gonna get a pork loin, and then you're gonna get baby back ribs. The full rack of ribs, pound for pound, is the best value, unless you're shopping at Costco, because Costco is super discounted. So this is a full rack of spare ribs, which includes the breastbone, and you can see this is $3.49 a pound. Fairly economical. Baby back ribs, $4.99 a pound. St. Louis ribs are $2.89 a pound. Now this is a great price because it's from Costco. If you're only looking for St. Louis ribs, then you're probably better off buying the St. Louis cut. But if you're like us and you have multiple uses for the meat, for the ribs, then we usually buy the whole rack of spare ribs. We cut them up, we just bag them up in Ziploc bags and servings. If you're at the butcher, you don't see him, or even if you're at the grocery store or even Costco, ask the butcher and he almost certainly will have them. The spare ribs are best value for Chinese cooking because you get a variety of cuts. These spare ribs are extra wide, whereas these St. Louis ribs are thin. That breastbone piece is cut off already. You get this breastbone piece off to the side that you can use for roasted rib tips. You could use it for soup. You could even throw it into the meat grinder. It's almost like when you get a full bone-in pork shoulder, which I have a video on how to break it down, and you get a lot of use out of that, great value out of it, but you gotta do a little bit of work. So what are boneless ribs? Well, they're actually not ribs. When you're in a Chinese restaurant and you see boneless ribs, or when you're in the grocery store and you see boneless country ribs, they're cut from the pork shoulder. In the Chinese restaurant, boneless ribs are cut into thinner slices, roasted, and then cut into strips to look like ribs. Boneless ribs, we have that recipe on the blog. You just use boneless pork butt or boneless country ribs. They're nice and marbled and really tasty, but not a rib. So here we have the three ribs, baby back ribs, the St. Louis ribs, and the whole spare rib. These baby back ribs, you might want to take this membrane off because it may get a little bit tough and it may cause your ribs to curl even. Same here for this membrane, but otherwise it's ready to go. So these baby back ribs, if I flip them over, and you can see there's some nice meat on here, and this meat is really super tender. As opposed to these St. Louis ribs, they're all kind of more uniform. They're not quite as thick and meaty on the back. Don't get me wrong, there's a lot of meat on here. There's a little bit more fat. I usually don't trim it off unless there's a lot of fat on it because they'll render down a bit and they'll taste really nice. So this spare rib piece is what we're gonna work with today, because we do have to process these. We never cook this spare rib whole like this. We always break it down. So first things first is you wanna trim this bit of fat off. Make sure you got a nice sharp knife. You wanna tug away at it a little bit. And then you have this meat flap. Now this meat flap can get a little bit tough. You wanna trim it off. And then you're gonna make your major cut here. Keep in mind here that this is hard bone. Right beyond this is cartilage. So you can actually use a regular knife, a good cleaver or a chef's knife. You don't need a bone knife. And you can see that we just cut through this cartilage bone and then pull this back a little bit. You want these ribs to be somewhat straight and make this cut just like this. Father taught me that because we used to do this all the time in the restaurant. And there you go. So this is a St. Louis rib now. And then this is a little bit tough flat meat here. You could leave this, or you could just trim it off. I'm gonna trim it off. And let me get the store-bought St. Louis rib. This is a little bit shorter rib. I cut my rib a little bit longer, but you notice all the similarities. This flat meat sometimes gets a little bit tough depending upon what you're gonna do, so you may wanna trim it off. We use this flat meat for stir fries, and we cut it into little strips so it's less tough. And then you get this rib tip piece, which is basically a lot of cartilage bone here with meat, and then you get this one little small piece of hard bone, which if you want to cut this, you can use a bone cleaver, or you just cut it here and drop it into your soup. Taking this membrane off, get underneath this with your finger.
It's not coming off that easy.
Yeah, it's not that easy. That's why I was sort of dreading it.
So if you're doing fall apart ribs, it's actually kind of toss-up of whether it's good to remove the membrane, because the ribs will fall apart.
That's correct. I think there's a couple of ways to cook it. You can sort of barbecue these ribs in the oven for a shorter period of time, and they're not going to fall apart, and they're going to have a little bit of springiness to them, which is usually how Chinese restaurants do it. Unlike Southern barbecue, which are fall apart ribs, but you can do either. That's the membrane. It's all off. So now, from our whole spare rib, we have our rib tip, the St. Louis rib, and of course your scraps here. I'm going to show you a couple of tips and tricks on how to break it down further for some Chinese recipes. Now this piece, if you're calculating for your guests, there's about 12 ribs on one of these racks. Sometimes a little bit more. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. That doesn't include this other small piece. The best ribs obviously are these big ones here. So you got this little end piece, and what I'll do a lot of times, I'll just take that, cut it off. Kind of like a half a rib, and then this piece, it's a little tiny rib. Sometimes I'll trim that off. This is also nice for steamed ribs. So Judy has a grilled rib recipe where you cut these into individual pieces. In this case, we'd use this. I'm not going to cut this one right now because I'm going to roast this whole, but you cut these along these lines and then marinate them individually and throw them on the grill, or roast this whole thing. But if you plan to make a steamed ribs or a braised ribs where you need small chunks, cut this like this. You have this cartilage bone. You're going to have to cut through the cartilage bone. We cut them this way, which you're going to need a bone cleaver if you're doing it at home. You can ask the butcher to do it for you because they got a bandsaw. The other thing is now Chinese grocery stores, and I even see some supermarkets sell individual riblets that have been cut. Sometimes in long pieces where all you have to do is cut these, and sometimes actually in individual pieces. They charge a little bit more, but you have to do less work. Look at this bone. It's kind of angled this way. That's your clue. That's how you're going to get even rib where you got meat on both sides. And you go down a line like this and you're like, oh, okay, that's where it is, right? So now you cut it and there you go. You found it. There's no bone in between. Now to cut this hard bone, you need this heavy cleaver knife. The best thing to do is take this little rag. It's an old damp rag. I'm going to put it here. Put this right on top of here because then it has a little bit of a cushion and it's less prone to slide. Try not to cut it with the meat on the bottom because then it's going to slide around. You cut it either on the side like this, or you can cut like this through the meat and do that. And then you've got these bones. Now, after you cut them, you want to rinse all these bones underneath water so you don't have these bone chips. Very unpleasant. That's why it's nice to have the butcher do it, because they do it when it's sort of half frozen and they use like a little bandsaw and and you don't have any bone chips. Definitely for braising, this is the size you want. And we've got a ton of braised rib recipes. If you want it meatier, you just cut it in half. And sometimes these whole ribs, I'll just cut these whole ribs and we'll just drop them into soup. So we have watercress soup. The ribs are very flavorful for the soup. And then after they've been simmering in the soup for a long period of time, pork gets really super soft and you have these pork bones where you dip it into soy sauce, which is really, really nice. So this is the rib tip bone that we took off the spare ribs. This is actually mostly meat. And then you can start feeling up here, you'll see cartilage. So two things you could do with this. You could actually cook the rib tips with these cartilage bones, which is what we usually do, and actually save some of this meat. And this is great for stir fries. Now the grain goes this way. So what we usually do is cut this in half, take this membrane off. You have to sort of do a combination of tugging and cutting. It's okay if you don't get all of it, but you want to try to get most of it. It's actually not terrible if you leave some of this membrane. Key is, you see how this grain goes? So now if I cut like this across the grain, these strips will be tender now. And these are great for stir frying. There's a membrane on this piece and there's the grain going this way. And you say, hey, we got to cut this membrane off. No, not really. It's for me, it's not worth it to fuss over these membranes. Why? Because we're actually cutting them. So you get a little tiny piece of membrane for each thin strip, and it's not that bad. So we're gonna be velveting this anyway. It's even gonna be more tender, and you can check out our post on how to velvet pork for stir fry. All right, so this hard breastbone is the other place where you're gonna need this bone cleaver. There's a couple ways to do it. One, you could just cut it just like that. Cut it into bite-sized pieces. You can use this in a stew or even in a steamer, or you could just leave it whole and put it into soup. And that's what usually I do. Then we've got this beautiful rib tip cut here where I'm gonna slow roast the rib tip, and you could leave these pieces, but they might dry out. You might wanna cut these off, but I think I'm gonna leave these. So we've got rib tips, which is great for our fall apart barbecued rib tips, little riblets that you use for steamed ribs and black bean sauce or any braised spare rib dish, meat for any kind of stir fry or lo mein, and don't forget these baby back ribs for Sarah's char siu ribs recipe, and of course the prize here is a nice meaty rack of St. Louis ribs, which you can make Chinese barbecue ribs with. So using the whole spare rib is the economical way, multiple uses, much cheaper price. So if you like this video, like and subscribe to our YouTube channel and visit us often at thewalksoflife.com. Ribs can be confusing, everybody. I mean, there's country ribs, spare ribs, pork ribs, St. Louis ribs, baby back ribs.
One more time, but just don't say pork ribs.
Yeah.
Don't say pork ribs?
You were like St. Louis ribs, pork ribs, but they're all pork ribs.
Oh.